Prime Media audiences. This is your host, Ladette Moleta. Today I am joined with a guest from Paris, France. Her name is Odile Bizouni Shamanda. I'm really excited that she's joining me. Ms. Shamanda, thank you for joining me over Zoom. I really appreciate you taking your time from your busy schedule and joining me here over Zoom.
Thank you, Libet. Thank you.
You're welcome. I would like you to tell the audiences a little bit about yourself. So if you can give us a brief description and whatever you would like to share, I would really appreciate that.
Well, I'm actually running as a candidate for the legislative election in France. But to explain a little bit from who I am, I've been involved in politics since quite a time, actually. I was a music student when I discovered the LaRouche movement. And this was shortly after the first oil shock in 1973. And it was kind of a revelation for me because it was how so dramatic crisis could be artificially engineered. And very quickly after I joined this movement, and I've been fighting since that time for the right of every person, every country for development, access to progress, development in all fields, means economic development, social development, cultural development. And being in France, I met Jacques Cheminade, whom later I married. And Jacques Cheminade has been 3-time candidate for the French presidential election. The first time was in 1995, and at that time he won a wide reputation and credit because he announced that we were heading toward a very severe economic crisis. And indeed, in 1998, you had, if you remember, the Asian economic crisis, which was a first step, so to speak. And later, we had the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, which really shook the world. And it was really, we never really recovered from that. And at the time, Jacques, my husband, was the first to have announced that. Now everybody agrees that the system is really in bad shape. And that's why one of the reasons for what is going on in the world, of the situation which is going on in the world today. And it is one of the reasons, it is a situation in the world which is really very worrying. What we see in Ukraine, what we see with the economic crisis, what we see with this question of agriculture and hunger, which is threatening many parts of the world. Those reasons are why I decided to run as a candidate for those elections.
Great introduction. I get excited bringing guests from different countries because I get to learn a lot and my audiences get to learn a lot. And I'm very honored that you are here discussing this. And I mean, talking about presidential elections in France just concluded. For some reason, due to information sharing around the world, globalization, our world is much more smaller than we think now. This election has gotten a lot of attention worldwide. Internationally, people talked about the French elections. It seems, it seems more than before. Why is that? Why do you think so?
Well, I would summarize it in the following way. Macron, the president, is embodying a policy of submission to neoliberalist and Atlanticist interests. And its failure to win the re-election would have meant the end of a policy which have gripped Europe since the 19th, and which it's not only in France, it's also for all European countries. And in very practical terms, this policy, the policy of Macron, is organizing the dismemberment of the state in France and the public sector, with the aim to offer it to private investors. So it's very clear, for example, for the health sector, but also the education sector. So there is a lot of discontentment in the population, and you probably heard about the Yellow Vest movement, which is a reflection of that. And for this Yellow Vest movement, it was even more basic in a way, is that people who are poor people who didn't benefit at all from Macron's policies, at some point they couldn't pay. There was inflation in gasoline prices, and people, they just couldn't take it, this inflation again, and they started to protest, and then it evolved, and it became something very wide. And Macron had to break that, and he did it very violently, very. So it created really a shock. And plus his policy overall, they just benefited to the richest people. So the richest people in France became even more rich, and the poorer people became even more poor. So basically you had a really wide expectation that Macron would lose the election. You had people who just expected that, and it didn't happen. Because mainly not so much because of Macron himself, to a certain extent. What he did was very clever. He just didn't campaign. He waited for his rivals to campaign, and let's put it bluntly, most of them were so mediocre, of an utmost mediocrity, that he could win. And things were arranged so that Macron, in the second round, because you have 2 rounds of elections, in the second round, he was alone with his opponent was Marine Le Pen. And Marine Le Pen is a kind of, how would you call that? She's being used since decades and decades as a way to manipulate politics. So there was just one debate with Marine Le Pen, and Macron won it very easily, and he got his victory, although it is a victory which is not such a big victory, because there was a substantial abstention, really very substantial, because also most of the people, I would say a large majority of people in France, voted someone who would embody that program. It was really a negative vote in that respect. And so now it might be very, who knows what will happen, who knows, but there is a very deep resentment in the country. So we don't know if we say what will happen. What is clear is that it took him about 1 month, full month, to shape his government. And now there will be this legislative election, which is being presented as the third round of the presidential election, which normally it is not, but that's how it is being played now, indeed.
Yes, Odile, I did see that there was a huge number of people that did not cast a vote for a candidate this election. It was almost reported at some media that 24, 27, 34% at different times did not cast a vote. It reminded me of the election of the U.S. During election time between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, because many people didn't cast a vote because a good amount of people were disappointed. Their choice, a good portion of the population had voted for Bernie Sanders, and he was not a candidate in the final round. The public responded by not voting to show their dissatisfaction with the political party, especially with the Democratic Party. And that eventually, gave way for the other candidate to be elected. So I think it was something similar seen in France.
I think there is also a very specific stake with France, because it is a country which has been key in the elaboration of the European community, and as you said, many people, many countries were looking at those elections as a signal. And I think this signal was whether a certain kind of policy which is dominating today Western countries, and in particular Europe, whether those policies were going to be rejected by votes or not. And well, the result is there. They have not been rejected, which means there's a continuation to this basically financial policies, because what Macron has done was a policy which was totally favorable, as I told you, to the richest people, which is one thing, but which is the submission of France to this idea that you run an economy with a monetarist policy. Basically, you are not transforming the real economy. For example, France, we don't have almost industry left so far. And the policies defended by Macron are not going in the direction of rebuilding a true industry, a true agriculture, quite the contrary. And these things, people are looking at it and they just say, okay, but how are we going to do? Just a very basic question at some point.
So currently there's another election happening. Can you tell us what's happening? Because a lot of people do not know the political system in detail of France. And as we know, a lot of times the political situations in most African countries is very much discussed in the European platforms, but we often don't have African medias focusing on the political issues of European countries. So I'm really grateful that we're able to discuss this with you. Tell me what's happening with elections now.
A consequence of that was that election, legislative election, now is occurring after the presidential election, 1 month or in that because both of those elections were dissociated, and hence you had but now what happens is that the legislative elections are functioning as a confirmation of the presidential election. This means that Macron has been elected, and now Macron needs a majority at the parliament, at the National Assembly. If he doesn't have this majority of deputy, he won't be able to govern, especially that he's in a situation where he's not very popular, to say the least. So he desperately needs this majority. And you have all the opposition parties who have taken the opportunity to say, well, this should function as a third round of the presidential election. So that's why there is so much stakes with those legislative elections. Basically, the question is, is the president, is he going to be to govern? Okay, then what is going to happen? And Jean-Luc Mélenchon is trying to push the idea that if he wins enough seats, then it could be nominated as a prime minister. Because these legislative elections are seen as a means to counter already now the policies of Macron, to say the least. Again, especially since the situation that we do have in the world now. In any case, I think that it will be really difficult for Macron to govern, and the passion to go with more brutal. One of his first that to introduce that he already announced, and which was, by the way, supposed to be passed already in his last mandate, is a reform of retirement pension, and this will be extremely unpopular. So we might head in France toward again another policy which takes into account the needs of France and of the population. I mean, we don't have the system of check and balances that you have in United States. It tends to be very vertical. It's a presidential system where the president has really a lot of power, who more and more is really ruling alone, and with very little consultation. So that's one of the problem, is that there is indeed a president who is taking a lot of decision by himself, with very little consultation, and with just precisely, there is a certain real lack of check and balances, and unfortunately, the parliament, which should have this role, is very weak. And during the last 5 years, most of the laws that Macron wanted to pass have been passed against the will of a majority of people most of the time, but because he had a majority in the parliament. Although, he had a comfortable majority at the beginning, and at some point you had deputy who started to leave because they didn't agree with what was his policy, because it was extremely directive, it was extremely with no consultation, and with a lot of things that people couldn't stand in France, So it has been a very brutal, in a way, presidency, and the danger is that it continues to go into that direction for the benefit of his own electorate. And Macron electorate is generally among people who are the higher classes of the French population, and also older people, So those people are benefiting from his policies, but not the rest of the population.
So this pretty much basically is saying it's a check and balance system. The decisions made, has that always been the history of France? Has the president or the prime minister have always had the ability to make all the decisions?
Well, it is pretty much his way of running things, because all presidents in France are given pretty much power by the constitution, but they would. They were running things in a very different style, with taking into account the opposition, with a very different approach, and it just depends also of the policy which is being proposed. The big reference in France is obviously General de Gaulle, who had a policy which was a policy of a government for the people, by the people, for the people, and he stand with that. So hence France had a policy, a government by the people, excuse me, but in any case, what I wanted to say is that he had a policy which was a social policy, a policy of redistribution, solidarity among people, and so that the richness which were produced by people, you had mechanism to make a repartition. So that's how people in France, that's how people, how France first developed, that we had what we called the 30 glorious years, where people could benefit, all the society could benefit of the work of anyone. And this, with the time, was attacked. And it, at some point, with Sarkozy and then with Hollande, they submitted to the financial inquisition, I would say, you know, that money, that you had to see everything in terms of money, of debt, you know, and not any longer in terms of the people. What policy are you doing for the people, you know? And Macron, to a certain extent, has become even more than people who were before him. He has become the embodiment of this. And to an extent now, which is just unbearable. During the COVID crisis, for example, at the same moment where the health nurses, people in the hospital had to, were dedicating themselves to save lives, you had policies to cut beds in the hospitals, to reduce the number of beds in the hospital, to reduce the number of people who are paid. People in the hospital, for example, in the public hospitals, are paid very, very little, you know. And the idea is in the health sector is to progressively push people out of the hospital and to make them go to the private clinics and private health establishment, which of course will make a lot of money, you know. That's what is going on. This is an example among very a lot of other examples. The same is true, for example, in the education sector, you know. Now you do have, for one of the first year ever, you have now recruitment, it's a recruitment, they are now recruiting for the next, after the holidays, after the summer holidays. And you have very few people who want to be teachers because they are very badly paid. But what they are doing is that before teachers in the public education, the education in France is for free. You don't pay for the education. And we had a very high standard of education. And the standard of education has been lowered and lowered each and passing years. And now what they are doing is that they are firing, they are trying to find the means to fire public servants. So they cannot do it directly. So they have to find other ways to do it. And instead of recruiting new public servants, only people who have a short contract are being recruited. So they have the level of competency is much less. They are paying the same way, but they can be fired absolutely at any time. and they have no word to say. So that's what is at stake now, and people are very furious about that.
We are almost running out of time. A lot of people might not know the details of France politics. Usually, international African countries, like I mentioned, dissect African issues, African matters, but not the other way around. Africans also need to be aware and interested in the leaders that are leading the European countries, just like France and other European countries or Western world is very much interested in who is leading African countries. They're not only just watching, but they're very concerned, interfering, and at times even selecting the leaders of Africa. So I think this is very important.
The French policies toward Africa at this point, I think, is very poor. It's not what it should be at all. And again, that's one of the reasons why I'm running as a candidate, because I think we have to do totally differently. I'm working with the Schiller Institute internationally, which is a think tank which has been created on the need of development for all the planet. And the type of policies that we are defending and that I would like France to do, it's development policies on water, energy, health, education, energy, and so on and so forth. Basically, everything which is concerns infrastructure. First, I know there will be in 2063, if I am not mistaken, the African Union, there will be a big meeting. And at that point, I think that France should be really working with African nations to do the same type of policies as China did. China was able to cooperate with Ethiopia on the reconstruction of the railways between Addis Ababa and Djibouti. They did it. It was done. It functions, and it's a very important for Ethiopia, of course. As far as I know, there was also a project which has been launched in 2007, if I am not mistaken, which is a green belt. So I don't know where it stands by now, but it was this idea to repel the desertification of the country, and it is just great. Why France is just not doing that? This is my question. This is why I'm totally very concerned. Why France is not part of this type of project? Why France is, when it has project in Africa, through the Agency of Development, French Agency of Development, it is always the type of kind of tiny project, which change nothing. So it gives a good consciousness, but it changed fundamentally nothing. I think that precisely French people abroad, that's often people who have a lot of competencies. That's people who have a high degrees of education most of the time. Most of the time they're working for companies who are involved in some type of interesting project. So this should be put together, and it should be redefined so as to fit in those type of project that I'm trying to describe. Infrastructure. Why, for example, I don't know, I'm thinking about the Inga, the great Inga dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It will be realized and finished so that there is energy in Africa, that there is enough energy for everyone, that there are electricity grid to Africa, that there are trains which can be built through all of Africa. There is huge works to be done. And so far, the policy of France are not going into that direction. My work is precisely to do that, to do so that it goes into that direction, and that we do have a real cooperation with all African countries. And I think with Ethiopia, it would be all the greatest, because Ethiopia, it's a, I love archaeology, and it's in Ethiopia that we found the rest of the first identified human beings. That's in Ethiopia that we found Lucy, the first human beings, that we could identify. So there is a lot of cooperation that should be done, that could be done, and that in which France should participate. And this would really change the world for the better.
So I'm very honored and very grateful that you have spent your time with me and sharing this information. I wish you good luck with all your endeavors. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to your audience too. Thank you.
Prime Media audiences, this is your host, Ledette Muleta. This was my half an hour with Odile. I'll be back with another guest.